In the simplest of words, Philly's mass transit system has been upended. In the last 55 days, Pennsylvania lawmakers have stalled on passing a complete, finished state budget. Without the disbursement of funds, it has put a financial strain on school districts, nonprofits, and local governments. And it's decimated the way hundreds of thousands of people travel in our city and in our region. So how did things get so bad? My guest today is Alan Fisher. He's got a background in mechanical engineering. He also posts explainer videos on YouTube and social media talking about urban planning, transportation, and the rail industry. Alan says we're here because SEPTA and the state have a, quote, toxic relationship. He's here to break down what that means. It's Monday, August 25th. I'm Trinina Ray, and here's what everyone in Philly is talking about. Alan, I saw your video titled "Everyone is Lying About SEPTA," which kind of gave a brief history of how SEPTA evolved from kind of being a disjointed set of private rail networks to a cohesive transit network that we know today. And yet you are critical about the funding model of SEPTA too. So we'll talk more about that later. But first, Alan, take me back to the 60s. How were Philadelphians getting around in the city before SEPTA?
Yeah. So I think the funny word there to use is cohesive because, like you said, SEPTA is kind of glued together by putting together a bunch of private companies and one public company. But roughly in the 60s, when SEPTA was originally made, you had the Philadelphia Transit Company. You had the private railroads, which were the ones that were running your commuter services out to the suburbs. And then you also had the mixture of trolley or interurban services that were running out also into the suburbs. And they kind of all worked together more or less before. But when SEPTA had to take over the Philadelphia Transit Company, specifically, that sort of was the first step for putting everything together. Because that was all of your buses, all of your trolleys in the city, and the subways, of course. And even then, the subways were built for entirely different reasons. The Market Frankfurt L was completely privately financed for the most part, and then eventually taken over by a public entity. And the Broad Street line was entirely funded by city bonds, and to this day, is still owned by the city, but SEPTA operates it. So there's a bunch of different funding models and stuff that even in the past were used to build the system. And up until now, it's kind of weird to look back at that era and realize like, wow, they kind of all just worked. And
it seems complicated though.
Yeah. And so the 60s marked the beginning of the first wave of consolidation where a lot of the smaller agencies that weren't out of the Philly region, like the trolleys and like some of the stuff that went to the very local suburbs, like the Delco trolleys, they were very, very subjected to economic change. And as we sort of study Philadelphia history, the 60s marks the beginning of what I would consider sort of the industrial decline from the era of post-industrial basically being a city. And also there was various other problems like white flight and stuff like this with people moving to the suburbs and away from the city and taking money with them. And with this, the transit agencies kind of lost a lot of their easy money.
Easy money?
Easy money being like, it's really easy to move someone down the block versus moving someone from the suburbs to the city. So it's economically a lot harder. And when you lose a lot of the density with people moving away and your network is built for moving people in a dense area, suddenly your business model falls apart. And even then, a lot of these private companies back in the day, they were riding the edge of profitability the entire time. And you can see waves of privatization going to government ownership around that time. And SEPTA and Philly were no exception. But what Philly lasted a bit longer on was the commuter rail system. So Philadelphia is served by was served by two larger railroads that were commuter railroads. This was the Pennsylvania Railroad, who ran into 30th Street and Suburban Station, and the Reading Railroad, which we all famously still know in Philly because Reading Terminal Market still exists, which was a market below Reading Terminal. And these two railroads technically competed with each other, but basically served different areas. The Reading mostly served stuff to the north, which is like Jenkintown and Doylestown, where the Pennsylvania Railroad mostly served stuff either along the river, like the current corridor, or the Keystone Main Line. But through various different means and various different problems, these companies eventually did have issues. And in the late 60s, SEPTA started subsidizing these companies to run their services because Philadelphia, even back in the 60s, realized that, like, even though we have to pay money now for these services, they are completely worth it compared to losing some of the access to the suburbs and stuff like this via transit. And eventually, SEPTA in 1980 taking over completely the network from these freight railroads.
And is that then what we now know as the regional rail?
Yes, that's now what we know as regional rail. And the network then would slightly change because around that time, one of the only good things to come from the Rizzo era was that there was funding that was gotten for SEPTA that was to make the network one. Because since there was two different systems, there was the Reading and then there was the Pennsy, they felt like they were separate. They weren't one system. So the idea was we should link them together. And that's how we got the Center City commuter connection, which is the tunnel that goes between Suburban Station next to Love Park, under Love Park, under where Reading Terminal is, and then back up through a tunnel and then through a new viaduct to connect to what we now know as Temple Station or University Temple Station. And Reading Terminal was no longer used. It's now part of the convention center, and the old viaduct in Callow Hill is now kind of derelict, except for that one piece that's now part of the park.
The rail park, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we've got to talk about and break down this whole funding issue and why this relationship between what you say is a government-funded mass transit agency and why there seems to be difficulty. And we're at this pressure point. Yesterday is when service for SEPTA was pulled back significantly. And that has real ripple effects in how we are transporting people to work, to school, to doctor's appointments. Alan, kind of break it down for me, real basic. When did the relationship between SEPTA and the state government get sour?
So to start with that, we sort of have to talk about SEPTA's funding model. Let's say their operating budget roughly comes from fares, which is the ticket that they collect on the train or the one that you use at the turnstile, from the counties that SEPTA operates in. So either Philadelphia as a county or the local ones like Delco or something above it like Montgomery. The state is involved because back when SEPTA was created and the commuter railroads were part of SEPTA and still are with regional rail, the state viewed SEPTA as a state asset because it ran through many places in southeast Pennsylvania and slightly further back in the day. So it made sense that the state would invest money into SEPTA year over year in their operating budget, especially when they went further. But even then, it's like the Philadelphia region generates most of the GDP for Pennsylvania in general, and even back in the day did too. So it makes it obvious that as a state and as sort of a nation building thing, that you would reinvest in the thing that makes you the most amount of money or tax income. And so the state investing in SEPTA is both a logistical thing of we want to keep our network running, but also a reinvestment in making money because it's the economic engine of southeast Pennsylvania. So we come to the modern day, which SEPTA still roughly uses the same funding model. And so the state still needs to give SEPTA money to operate. Not much usually. It's usually only been in the mid 100s, or now as inflation has grown over time, it's now the low 200s of millions of dollars, which is not a lot of money compared to some of the other programs that the state funds.
Then why is this so toxic? Why have our conversations in the last days and weeks been so chaotic?
Yeah, that's kind of the frustrating aspect is that so for a long time, SEPTA has sort of been a non-political issue. There's been some back and forth, and there's also some, I would say, power players that caused issues or would help here and there. But the main thing is that SEPTA was never really seen as a super like heavy political issue on one side or the other. Like even the Republicans back in like the 90s or 2000s would generally agree to fund SEPTA with like a few stipulations here and there about how it would be funded or maybe the certain little things that they would want them to do. But for the most part, it was not really an issue. And if there was a bill passed called Act 89, which essentially would guarantee SEPTA funding for the next 10 years at least, and a certain amount out of the General Transportation Fund from Pennsylvania. And so that was made SEPTA actually have one of their best eras, in my opinion, which is in the modern era from 2012 to 2022, because they knew they were going to be funded every single year for 10 years. So you can actually start planning things further out, especially when you don't have to lobby the state all the time.
That seems like a good thing, right?
Yes, definitely
Yeah.
a good thing. It's really nice to know your paycheck's coming in and you don't have to argue with your boss every year.
Interesting. So Act 89 was passed in 2013 and gave a funding boost to transit across the Commonwealth. SEPTA got the most out of any other agency in the state. This funding within the bill expired in 2022, and the state house did not renew it. So while it's still active, it is not giving out funding for SEPTA in substantial amounts anymore. Why was it not renewed?
Because at the time, as we know, the country sort of started becoming more polarized, especially after the first Trump administration. And the Republicans started seeing things less as I'm reinvesting in my community, I'm reinvesting in my state, and more of a I hate the liberals, I hate the cities. I don't like the things that are related to the cities. So SEPTA was seen as sort of a political target. Now, and that's the frustrating part. In 2023, Josh Shapiro was elected, and so that meant that we had a Democratic governor. And so when recently we now have a Democratic House, and there's now only a Republican Senate, it's become more of a thing of that the Democrats now have flipped essentially the state government, and that now the power lies back in the Democrats more than the Republicans. And so now, last year and this year, the Republicans actually had many issues trying to figure out a budget because the Democrats could force them to sort of agree to things. And last year, they did the same thing where they essentially held up the budget for a while with SEPTA funding. And there was even floated the same thing as last year, which was a gambling tax, or they're calling a skills game tax. But they ended up stalling for so long that SEPTA actually couldn't get the funding in time. So last year, we had to do something similar where Josh Shapiro actually used emergency transportation funds that were given from the federal government to then fund SEPTA for the next year. And that's sort of how we arrive at today.
Okay. Interesting. We've got more on SEPTA and its funding after the break. I always want to look at situations in the fairest way. And arguments about SEPTA have been several, right? Folks have talked about fare evasion as being an issue that SEPTA needs to address. The activity, the violent activity, the drug use that has been on SEPTA. People bring up just not being effective, being late, not knowing when your bus is coming. And then the other argument is just, well, what does the SEPTA Philadelphia region have anything to do with folks in Erie and Allegheny counties and counties where it doesn't touch? How would you address that? And I feel like you've addressed some of these in a recent op-ed you wrote in the Inquirer. You kind of push back on some of these issues.
Yeah, so let's talk about the first aspect, which is either fare evasion, crime, nebulous crime, or generally, I guess, problems with the system like trains being late or not in good condition. The problem with that no one seems to understand is that you can't fix any of those things by cutting money from the agency. There seems to be this mindset that like we need to punish SEPTA because things are underfunded, which like let's say fare evasion, for example. The two ways you can solve fare evasion, one works way better than the other, but both of them need money, which is you can either put more cops at more of the stations to sort of enforce the fact to make people not fare evade, which is expensive because you need to hire more police force, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other thing, which is way more effective, that's also cheaper, is installing new fare gates that are hard to hop at all train stations. And both of those things cost money. SEPTA has actually been doing the second thing, which is the new fare gates. They've gone up at 69th Street. They're going up at City Hall. I think they're putting them up at Cecil B. Moore and 34th Street soon. And I think 30th is the next one also. But things like that is that like those fare gates aren't free. They don't go into operations budgets. They go into capital budgets. And even if you wanted a bigger police force, you'd need a higher operating budget too, because that is a thing that not necessarily will return on value as much as the fare gates will. And even then, there's a lot of problems with putting cops in the system in general. And then it's same with the trains. If you want better service or if you want better reliability, you need to invest in that. You need to get your return on value. And so it's strange to me that people are like, oh, I want the government to upgrade my roads. I want the government to fix my road. But when it comes to SEPTA, no, we need to underfund them to teach them a lesson. Not the fact that I want the government to fix my train. There seems to be a disconnect here. So when it comes to the rest of people in Pennsylvania, I think it's something like 40 or 45% of Pennsylvania's tax base comes from just the Philadelphia region. And the Philadelphia region only makes up about, I think it's like 12% to 15% of the landmass of the state. So when we talk about the rest of the state and why they should care, a lot of their services are funded indirectly because Philadelphia is able to give the state a lot of tax revenue.
I listened to PA State Majority Leader Joe Pittman's speech in regards to the rural and urban divide in our state that we are feeling right now, especially when we talk about issues like funding SEPTA.
That was quite the speech. A lot of rural places, like where Joe Pittman's from, which is Indiana, Pennsylvania, even though it's a college town that is kind of well off in certain spots, it still is really reliant on the state in a lot of ways. Actually, there's a transit agency in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and a lot of the operating money for that transit agency comes from the state. And so a lot of things like rural roads, like either PennDOT-owned roads out in the more rural or mountainous areas, those are funded by the state. Local towns out in more distant areas in the state also don't have municipal local police. Oftentimes they will use state police, which are funded via state funds and turnpike funds. And it's just frustrating because this divide didn't seem to be as ridiculous 10, 15 years ago. And it's kind of just gotten worse in the last, I would say, 4 to 8 years. So it's a bunch of issues wrapped into one of necessarily they just don't like Philadelphia and would rather see the money go elsewhere. And SEPTA is just part of that.
Do you think there is a compromise here?
I think there's two ways to go about this. One is that I think that even though the Democrats have most of the government and are negotiating with the Republicans who only have the Senate, I think the Democrats have really dropped the ball on the ability to negotiate and get in front of the Republicans. I think they're really bad at suggesting, hey, here's this thing we're going to give you or would like to give you as long as you sign onto our bill. a lot of times they don't even think of like the things that the rural counties need. And I do blame the Democrats slightly on that aspect. If I were them, I would be much more aggressive at being like, oh, we know that we have transit in these areas, but we really think that the rural towns that we have in Pennsylvania are unique because they are still walkable compared to many states. So we're going to give all of our rural places a lot more transit service because you guys deserve it. And we want to reinvest in essentially the services that go between these places to try to get people from more economically depressed areas to be able to access different places without a car. And you aggressively like push that, and you essentially say you get the attention of people in those communities. And then you come back and say the Republicans are like, oh no, we don't want to fund SEPTA, et cetera, et cetera. Then you say, oh, you don't want to fund the stuff in your communities that's also in the bill. It's basically like an entirely like a PR game, essentially. And that's the place that the Democrats have really failed, I think, because you're supposed to be one step ahead of your opponent. And for a lot of this, it seems like the Democrats are one step behind. And that's why the Republicans are able to kind of push them in certain ways. The one big thing that it seems like the Republicans do want to negotiate on and sort of get out of the deal is this thing called the school voucher program.
Alan, tell me how that impacts this transportation conversation.
So the school voucher program, in short, is essentially a way for the Republicans to fund charter and private schools via state funds. So it's ideologically different from what a lot of people want or expect from the state government. So
they want funds to support public schools.
Usually something of that nature. And so the Republicans necessarily want that. And so probably what will happen is that in negotiations coming up, the Democrats will have to give something to the Republicans to get the SEPTA funding through. And that will probably be the one thing that they will negotiate into the bill to get it, the funding through. The other thing is that the Republicans keep talking about this aspect of there's a budget deficit or something where eventually we're going to run out of the surplus that we have in the state.
Is that when people bring up legalizing cannabis and the tax on the skills games?
Yes, exactly. So there's been multiple proposals for how to fund things in the budget without the Republicans moaning about something about the surplus. And one of those has been the skills game tax, which is essentially a tax on any like casino machines or machines that you see in like
the gas stations.
Yeah. That's essentially one of them. And like most people, I think, would agree that that's a really good idea because essentially, like taxing things that are necessarily not good for people like cigarettes, it's like the government can make the process slightly more expensive for a necessarily not the best thing for the average person, and also get income to fund a good thing, which would be transit via it. You also have the, like you said, if they made recreational marijuana legal, they could use the funds or taxes that they make off of that to fund a lot of things in the government, actually a lot of things. And part of that would be transit. Unfortunately, the Republicans, ideologically wise, for some reason, still do not want that to pass. So I don't see the recreational marijuana thing happening until the Democrats have full control of the government. The skills game, though, I have heard has been negotiated back and forth, and roughly they're at the point where they're just debating over how much the tax percentage is on the skills game.
Another thing about this, like we talked about, was just efficiency. So how does SEPTA stack up against its peers in places like Chicago and Boston, or even over in Jersey or New York?
Essentially, SEPTA has for a bit had issues with the ridership coming out of the pandemic. And I think most of the transit agencies have had issues with ridership coming out of the pandemic. So most people, when they talk about these agencies, talk about pre-pandemic and modern day or current day. Philly has actually been one of the top performers when it comes to getting ridership back from the pandemic. We've actually been pretty much in third or fourth place, depending on what graph you're looking at when it comes to ridership coming back after the pandemic. We've either been right after New York and DC, we've been third, or we've been fourth after Boston sometimes sneaks a little ahead of us. And it's really interesting that Philadelphia compares to those places in general, because all three of those places have significantly more wealth and funding than Philadelphia, both as a region, but also as a transit agency. Washington, D.C. is notoriously well-funded, and as a city, very wealthy comparatively. New York is just huge. And Boston, of course, has a lot of funding, both from the state and as a very wealthy area in general. Philly has not ever had that luck or wealth. And some of the wealth has always been out in the suburbs, like along the main line. But when it comes to budgets and actually stretching things pretty far, that was part of what my article was about in the Inquirer, is essentially if you compare one of the most brutalist ways to compare transit agencies is to essentially take your budget and divide it by ridership. And that essentially gives you the amount that it costs to move one person. And SEPTA would continuously be one of the transit agencies that comes out with the best ratio for moving people for the least amount of money. Or another way to look at it is for a certain amount, a certain dollar amount, they are moving the most amount of people compared to other transit agencies. And there's various ways you can kind of see how SEPTA have done this over the years. Cutting the diesel services and sort of running all electric trains saves you money. And so they've figured out ways to do things like that, to cut off pieces of fat that necessarily would save the rest of the system to keep operating over year. And as they've done that, they've gotten actually really good at basically taking what little money they have and moving the most amount of people.
It is very hard to see the signs taped on a bus stop saying that this bus is going to be detoured or discontinued. It is hard to, have conversations with my family and friends and my neighbors, and we're all talking about just the inconvenience or the difficulties, the challenges it is going to be to get from home to work. It is difficult to have those conversations of service being late or folks being stranded that I've seen just in the past few days. I'm wondering if Harrisburg, and I know people see all of this, but it is difficult to live for many Philadelphians. It is difficult to live and to access services in our city without SEPTA.
So the problem with this whole aspect is that most of the politicians that we're interacting with, and even the Republicans do understand this. They do understand that it's a big issue. And that's part of the reason why this is blown up in the way it's blown up, is that unfortunately, it's also being used as a negotiating tactic, as if there's pain and essentially Philadelphia gets slightly hurt by some of these hits that they would be taking to public transit. The Republicans can then go to the Democrats and be like, look, you're hurting a lot. The city's hurting a lot. You must accept the bill, or you must accept our negotiations so that it can stop.
But can't Democrats flip that and say, hey, midterms are coming up next year. Things can flip.
So I agree.
But that would be like a really long time from now.
I agree. And it feels like a really long time in the time scale of losing our buses or train service, but it's not a long time politically.
Alan, I'm curious though, with all of this, what does SEPTA look like? What does mass transit look like, especially in 2026, next year, when we are hosting major events? The entire world is expected to be in the city. How are we going to move folks around the region?
Yeah, so it's kind of frustrating because I don't, as much as I think the state Republicans care about the image of Pennsylvania to people looking in from the outside, they also would rather shoot themselves in the foot as long as the foot of Philadelphia was in front of theirs. And I think two futures exist for SEPTA next year when it comes to sort of those events. One is you have a defunded system that necessarily have had to made severe cuts to the system. So maybe the Broad Street line that goes down to the stadiums, for example, might not go to some of the local stations in South Philly and instead would just run singular shuttle trains back and forth between like Walnut and then down to the stadiums. Or you could have regional rail trains that you would have specific sports trains that, since the schedules would be really bad in the first place where they're running every 2 hours, they'd run specific trains just for some of the sporting events that you would have to look at the schedule and get the singular train around that time instead of just showing up to your regional rail station and getting on the next train. So there's and that's not even talking about all the buses or the lower frequencies of like the possible subways cuts that we would see. So it's just frustrating. It's really frustrating that that's even an aspect we have to think about at this point. And then the other option, which is SEPTA gets the funding, operational funding to continue how they were before. And that's when we just have to start talking about the little things where it's like, oh, what's the little things that we can do to clean up the stations or to make Philly look better or to help people with directions? Or
to make it more accessible for folks.
Exactly. The normal things that we should be caring about, not the opposite, which is decline. It's crazy to even like think about that in the first place. And it's crazy to think that the Republicans essentially want Philadelphia to go back to the 1960s and 70s and watch the city decline and watch their state decline, because Pennsylvania is attached to Philadelphia, not the other way around.
Alan Fisher, thank you so much for joining me on CityCast Philly today.
No problem. Glad to be here.
That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. Let us know how you've been getting around Philly. We'll read your comments or play your voice memos. Just give us a call or send us a text at 215-259-8170. And we'll talk more about this later this week in our Friday News Roundup. Also, share this episode with a friend. Rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. And don't forget, you can support this show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Philly neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.